Chapter 3 of Is Mars Habitable? This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Is Mars Habitable by Alfred Russel Wallace. Chapter 3. The Climate and Physiography of Mars. Mr. Lowell admits, and indeed urges strongly, that there are no permanent bodies of water on Mars. That the dark spaces and spots thought by the early observers to be seas are certainly not so now, though they may have been at an earlier period. That true clouds are rare, even if they exist, the appearances that have been taken for them being either dust storms or a surface haze. That there is consequently no rain, and that large portions, about 2/3 of the planet's surface, have all the characteristics of desert regions. Snow caps, the only source of water. This state of things is supposed to be ameliorated by the fact of the polar snows, which in the winter cover the Arctic and about half of the temperate regions of each hemisphere alternately. The maximum of the northern snow caps is reached for the period of the Martian winter corresponding to the end of February with us. About the end of March, the cap begins to shrink in size in the northern hemisphere, and this goes on so rapidly that early in the June of Mars it is reduced to its minimum, about the same time the changes of colors take place in the adjacent darker portions of the surface, which become at first bluish and later a decided blue-green. But by far the larger portion, including almost all of the equatorial regions of the planet, remain always of a reddish ochre tint. See footnote 4 at the end of the chapter. The rapid and comparatively early disappearance of the white covering is, very reasonably, supposed to prove that it is of small thickness, corresponding perhaps to about a foot or two of snow in north temperate America and Europe, and that by increasing the amount of sun heat it is converted partly into liquid and partly into vapor. Coincident with this disappearance, and it's a presumed result of the water or other liquid producing inundations, the bluish-green tint which appears on the previously dark portion of the surface is supposed to be due to a rapid growth of vegetation. But the evidence on this point does not seem to be clear or harmonious. For in the four colored plates showing the planet's surface at successive Martian dates from December 30th to February 21st, not only is a considerable extent of the south temperate zone shown to change rapidly from bluish-green to chocolate-brown, and then again to bluish-green, but that the portions furthest from the supposed fertilizing overflow are permanently green, as are also considerable portions in the opposite or northern hemisphere, which one would think would then be completely dried up. No hills upon Mars. The special point to which I here wish to call attention is this. Mr. Lowell's main contention is that the surface of Mars is wonderfully smooth and level. Not only are there no mountains, but there are no hills or valleys or plateaux. This assumption is absolutely essential to support the other great assumption, that a wonderful network of perfectly straight lines over nearly the whole surface of the planet are irrigation canals. It is not alleged that irregularities or undulations of a few hundreds or even 1 or 2 thousands of feet could possibly be detected. Well, certainly all we know of planetary formation or structure points strongly towards some inequalities of surface. Mr. Lowell admits that the dark portions of the surface, when examined on the terminator, the margin of the illuminated portion, do look like hollows, and may be the beds of dried-up seas. Yet the supposed canals run across these old seabeds in perfect straight lines, just as they do across the many thousands of miles that are admitted to be deserts, which he describes in these forcible terms. Pitiless as our deserts are, they are but faint forecasts of the state of things existent on Mars at the present time. It appears, then, that Mr. Lowell has to face this dilemma. Only if the whole surface of Mars is an almost perfect level could the enormous network of straight canals, each from hundreds to thousands of miles long, have been possibly constructed by intelligent beings for purposes of irrigation. But if a complete and universal level surface exists, no such system would be necessary. For on a level surface, or on a surface slightly inclined from the poles toward the equator, which would be advantageous in either case, the melting water would of itself spread over the ground and naturally irrigate as much of the surface as it was possible for it to reach. If the surface were not level, but consisted of slight elevations and expressions to the extent of a few scores or a few hundreds of feet, then there would be no possible advantage in cutting straight troughs through these elevations in various directions with water flowing at the bottom of them. In neither case, and in hardly any conceivable case, could these perfectly straight canals, cutting across each other in every direction and at very varying angles, be of any use, or be the work of an intelligent race, if any such race could possibly have developed under the adverse conditions which exist on Mars. The scanty water supply. But further, if there were any superfluity of water derived from the melting snow beyond what was sufficient to moisten the hollows indicated by the darker portions of the surface, which at the time the water reaches them acquire a green tint, a superfluity under the circumstances highly improbable, that superfluity would be best utilized by widening, however little, the borders to which natural overflow had carried it. Any attempt to make that scanty surplus by means of overflowing canals travel across the equator into the opposite hemisphere, through such a terrible desert region, and exposed to such a cloudless sky as Mr. Lowell describes, would be the work of a body of madmen rather than of intelligent beings. It may be safely asserted that not one drop of water would escape evaporation or insoak at even 100 miles from its source. See footnote 5 at the end of the chapter. Miss Clerk on the scanty water supply. On this point, I am supported by no less an authority than the historian of modern astronomy, the late Miss Agnes Clerk. In the Edinburgh Review of October 1896, there is an article entitled New Views About Mars, exhibiting the writer's characteristic fullness of knowledge and charm of style. Speaking of Mr. Lowell's idea of the canals carrying the surplus water across the equator far into the opposite hemisphere for purposes of irrigation there, which we see he again states in the present volume, Miss Clerk writes, "We can hardly imagine so shrewd a people as the irrigators of Thule and Hellas, see footnote 6, wasting labor and the life-giving fluid after so unprofitable a fashion. There is every reason to believe that the Martian snow-caps are quite flimsy structures. Their material might be called snow soufflé, since, owing to the small power of gravity on Mars, snow is almost 3 times lighter than here. Consequently, its own weight can have very little effect in rendering it compact. Nor, indeed, is there time for much settling down. The calotte does not form until several months after the winter solstice, and it begins to melt as a rule shortly after the vernal equinox. The interval between these two epochs in the southern hemisphere of Mars is 176 days. The snow lies on the ground at the outside a couple of months. At times it melts while it is still fresh fallen. Thus, at the opposition of 1881-1882, the spreading of the northern snows was delayed until 7 weeks after the equinox, and they had accordingly no sooner reached their maximum than they began to decline, and Professor Pickering's photographs of April 9th and 10th, 1890, proved that the southern calotte may assume its definitive proportions in a single night. No attempt has yet been made to estimate the quantity of water derivable from the melting of one of these formations. Yet the experiment is worth trying as a help towards defining ideas. Let us grant that the average depth of snow in them of the delicate marsh